back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well, and welcome to today's video. We're going over my September and October reading wrap-up. Now, I didn't do a wrap-up video last month because of the move, so if you don't know, I announced in my previous video that we moved from Chicago to Austin, Texas, and I'm in my new space, and I did the whole library tour bookshelf organization last week, so go ahead and watch that if you haven't done so yet. And we'll get started with doing a very long wrap-up for September and October right now. Now, I didn't film a lot during that time, but I did read a lot. And we have a lot of books to go through because I made a lot of progress on my physical TBR, and I'm super proud of myself. And I'm happy that I got through a lot of the books that I had been wanting to read for a while. So let's get into the stats for the month of September. In the month of September, I read a total of 18 books, and 12 of them were romance, 3 paranormal romance, 1 fantasy, 1 dark romance, and 1 general fiction. Now, that kind of makes sense because romance is primarily the genre that I read on this channel, and we got through a lot of romance books. Also, keep in mind that the first few books that I'm going to go through are kind of like summer reads because you know, summer doesn't end until September 21st, so I was still reading a few summer books. I know we don't really want to be getting recommendations for summer books at this time of year, but that is what I read in September, so I am going to go over those, and I'll try to start with all the summer ones to get those out of the way first. So the first book I read in September was The Good Girl Complex by Elle Kennedy, and this is the first book in the Avalon Bay series. The second book and third book are Bad Girl Reputation and The Summer Girl, which I also read in September. This first book follows Mackenzie and Cooper. Mackenzie is from a very wealthy family, and she goes to college as a favor to her parents, but she doesn't really need to go to college because she actually already created this app, and she's making a lot of money off of it, and she's already self-sufficient. Well, she's in Avalon Bay to go to college, and she's dating this guy named Preston. Now, Preston is not a very nice guy. He goes to a bar and gets in a fight with one of the bartenders, Cooper, and gets him fired. So in order to exact revenge on Preston, Cooper decides to come up with this like revenge plot of stealing Preston's girlfriend, Mackenzie. So that's the basic premise of this book. It's actually really, really fun to read. It's very character based, so it's just kind of like their stories. There aren't that many events happening in this book, but it's like a really fun read. The story is fun. You really get into it, and you get to know the characters, and you start to care about them, and I thought the writing was really good, and so was the pacing, and it really kept me interested throughout the entire book. I think I finished this in like 1 or 2 sittings. It was really, really fast-paced and overall really fun, and I rated this one 4 stars. So that's going to be the first book of September. The next book in the series is Bad Girl Reputation, which follows Evan and Genevieve. Now, Evan is the twin brother of Cooper from the first book, and him and Genevieve used to date in high school, but then they ended up breaking up when she kind of moved away to Charleston. Now, she comes back into town because her mom dies, and she comes for the funeral, and her dad actually asks her to stay in town longer to help run the family business. So she runs into Evan again at their funeral reception, and in a moment of weakness, they almost hook up again. But then we learned that they've had this like kind of like toxic relationship that was on and off all the time, and he wants to get back together. So that's the basic premise of this book. At first, it's not really like a sweet romance. It's more of like an obsessive romance. It was such an interesting story because like at first they're so toxic, they're so bad for each other, but like they end up throughout the story growing together and actually becoming a positive influence on each other. And you can see the change in their relationship and in them as people from the beginning to the end. And I thought that was amazing. I loved this book. It was so fun to read. It was so fast-paced. It was interesting, and it's another one of those books that I finished in like 1 or 2 sittings. And I think I want to say I liked this one a little bit more than the first one. Elle Kennedy's writing is so good. She's just like really clear and concise. It's not super fluffy or anything like that, but it's like really good, well-paced writing, and I do really enjoy it. So I ended up rating this one 4 stars as well. So this one follows Cassie, and Cassie's back in town for the summer visiting her grandmother. She's essentially there for the summer, and she's looking for a summer fling. Now, she is on the beach one night, and she overhears this guy Tate being broken up with by his current like friend with benefit. Now, it turns out that Tate is also house sitting their neighbor's house next door. So they have this like kind of like forced proximity thing going on because they live next door to each other, and so she considers him to be her summer fling because he's like really good looking and like fun, and he does the whole friends with benefits thing. Now, I don't think I enjoyed this one quite as much as the first two books. I wasn't super invested in these characters. I didn't love the third act breakup, and there was a lot of family drama in this one that I just like kind of like didn't care for. So I ended up rating this one down a little bit. I gave it a 2.75 just because I wasn't like super into the story as much as I was into the first two, but it was still really, really fun. The writing was really good. The pacing was really good, and I still had a pretty good time reading this one. So that's The Summer Girl by Elle Kennedy. Okay, the next book I read was Summer Romance by Annabelle Monaghan, and this book follows the main character, Allie, who's 38, and she's a mom, and she's kind of going through a really hard time right now. She's going through a divorce. She recently loses her mom, who was her biggest support system, and she's just kind of having a hard time because like her house is a mess. She's not feeling like herself, and she's kind of struggling a little bit. And one day she takes her dog to the dog park, and her dog decides to pee on some guy's leg. But the guy is a really good sport about it. He's really funny, he's cute, and he asks her out. Because she's a single mom going through a divorce right now, she doesn't want anything serious, and Ethan agrees, and they just kind of like casually date. You still really end up caring about these characters. They're such well-written characters, and you get really, really invested in both of them. Allie is super relatable. You do not have to be going through the same kind of things that she is going through to like relate with her, and I thought she was such a well-written character. Ethan is also such a sweet guy. He falls first, but he doesn't like pressure her into doing anything, even for like the duration of their summer romance, and he just goes at her pace, whatever that may be. There's no on-page spice in this one, but the romance is written so well. It's so sweet, and I just really, really love this book. I liked it so much more than the first book of hers, Same Time Next Summer, I believe it was called, and I ended up rating this one 4.5 stars and actually rounded up to 5 stars on Goodreads. So that's Summer Romance by Annabelle Monaghan. Okay, the next book I read was The Plus One by Maisie Eddings, and this, honestly, I kind of forgot that I read this. Essentially, the main character, Indira, who was with this guy named Chris, and their relationship wasn't going so well. They kind of like felt like roommates when they were living together, and then she finds out that he cheated on her, so they end up breaking up. She ends up going to a different town, like nearby somewhere, for a wedding, and is staying with her brother while she's there. However, she also finds out that her brother's childhood best friend is kind of like living across the street or next door or something like that, and you know, she's really interested in him as well. So she then finds out that her ex-boyfriend Chris is coming to this wedding, and her and the brother's best friend, his name is Jude, end up kind of fake dating to this wedding. I think it's to make her ex jealous, but everybody basically knows that it's a fake relationship except for this guy, Chris. I wasn't super into this story. The plot was kind of like middle of the road for me. The characters were okay. I didn't really get super invested in them. I didn't really get super invested in the story, but the romance was pretty well developed, and I did enjoy that aspect of the story, and I ended up rating this one 3.25. And that is The Plus One by Maisie Eddings. The next book I read was The Bodyguard by Catherine Center, and this book essentially follows the main character, Hannah, who is a bodyguard. Now, this is a YA romance, so there's obviously no on-page spice in this, but it was still pretty fun. What happens in this one is she's a bodyguard, and her boyfriend is also a bodyguard at the same agency, but her mom ends up dying, and he ends up breaking up with her like literally the day after the funeral. Now, I don't know why this was such a popular like plot point in a lot of these books, but this is the third mom dying in this stack of books, and I'll be honest, I'm a little bit over it. So she gets assigned to protect this guy, Jack Stapleton, who's a movie star, and he's actually going to Houston to be with his sick mom. This was kind of like a middle of the road read for me. I wasn't super invested in the characters. Nothing really stood out to me about the plot or the writing or the story or anything like that, and I wasn't super invested in it. I ended up rating it a 3.25 because I did end up enjoying it well enough, but it wasn't one of my favorite stories. So that is The Bodyguard by Catherine Center. The next book I read was Forget Me Not by Julie Soto, and this author has really quickly become one of my favorite authors since I read this book. This takes place in Sacramento, and it follows the main character Emma, who is a wedding planner, and Elliot, who is a florist, and they met kind of like working on weddings together, and currently she's planning a celebrity wedding. Now, they used to date a while ago, but they ended up breaking up, and this is kind of like a dual POV in different timelines. The current timeline is in Emma's POV, and it's like after they're broken up, and the past timeline is in Elliot's POV, and it's like when they were together still before they broke up. Now, this is like one of the sweetest stories, the sweetest romances. I seriously love the backstory of this. I loved them together. The flirting and the banter was just so good. He is such a grump, like now and also 3 years ago, and it was just like so funny. But he actually comes through as one of the most amazing heroes that I've ever read in a book. And it's so emotional. It made me tear up. I was very invested in the characters and very invested in their story. And I highly recommend it. It was one of the best books I read this year. So this was a definite 5 stars, and it's Forget Me Not by Julie Soto. The next one that I read was The X-Files by Jessica Joyce, and this kind of follows like this group of friends in, I think they live in San Francisco, and the main character, Georgia, and one of the friends, Eli, used to date. Now, the friend group kind of separated because they all moved to different locations. Eli and Georgia ended up breaking up because of his job. He was like a financial analyst somewhere, so they ended up breaking up. But one of their best friends is now getting married in San Francisco, in Napa Valley actually, and they all fly back to San Francisco to go to this wedding. Well, things end up going wrong, so a few days before the wedding, Georgia and Eli end up going up to Napa Valley or down to Napa Valley. I don't really know the directions of where that is from San Francisco, but either way, they go to kind of like fix the venue situation because they're best man and best woman. The author does an amazing job writing the awkwardness and the tension between them, because like in the beginning while reading, you could really feel like this awkward tension between them, and it's just so realistic. This is a second chance romance, which generally isn't my favorite because breakups are always messy and hard, and there's hurt feelings and unresolved issues. And during the conversation between them, I almost felt like I wanted them to stay broken up, because like, how do you come back from that? But somehow the author did it. She did an amazing job. There's this moment where it all kind of like comes together and it hits you all at once. She really made this come full circle, and it all just kind of like made sense in the end, and she did such an amazing job with this book. Okay, sorry about that. The camera died and I had to swap out the battery. Where was I with this book? So I was saying that I generally like the male main characters to be a little bit more assertive than Eli was in books, and kind of like fighting for the love more so than he did. But he was a little bit different because he was more of like, he loved silently, and his love was like true and steadfast, and like it was just, it felt more realistic than, you know, the typical male main character who's like fighting for the love in like this assertive way. So I think she did an amazing job with this. It was very realistic, it was very emotional, and I really was invested in the story from the beginning to end, and I ended up rating this one 5 stars. So that is The X-Files by Jessica Joyce. The next book I read was The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood, and this one was obviously a 5-star read because it's Ali Hazelwood and she doesn't write anything that's not 5 stars. Anyways, this follows the main character, Olive. Now, Olive is a PhD student at Stanford in biology, I believe it was, and she has this best friend, and her best friend wants to date a guy that Olive used to date, and she feels bad about it because like it's her ex or whatever. So in order to make her friend feel good about dating her ex, and to convince her that she's over him, she essentially lies and tells her that she already has a date and she's going on a date. But she doesn't. She actually goes to work instead. So then she's at the lab that day, and it's later in the evening, but then her friend randomly shows up at the lab. And in order to not get caught in a lie, Olive grabs the first guy she sees and kisses him. It's exactly like the scene on the cover. She just grabs the first guy she sees, kisses him. This book does have quite a bit of miscommunication, but it's resolved rather quickly, and I did really like how it was resolved. Adam is like very, very sweet to Olive, but he's like not so sweet to everybody else at the school or whatever. And I really, really enjoyed that. I loved the writing, as always, with Ali Hazelwood, and it was just such an enjoyable book, so I highly recommend if you haven't read this, and it was a definite 5 stars. So that is The Love Hypothesis by Ali Hazelwood. The next book I read was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston, and this book follows Alex and Henry. Alex is the American first son, and his mom is going to be the first female president, and Henry is a British prince. So essentially this starts off with Alex and his family going to the UK for one of the prince's weddings, and Alex accidentally knocks over a $75,000 cake. Now, in order not to detract from his mother's presidential campaign, Alex and Henry have to basically like pretend that they like each other and do some public appearances and things like that, do some charity events and so on and so forth. They really don't like each other at first, but they do end up developing a friendship, and they do end up falling in love. Now, I loved the banter in this book. It was so cute and funny. I did think that the chapters were a little bit too long, and it did drag out a little bit in the middle. And so I did audiobook most of this, but it was still enjoyable, and I still really liked the story, and the writing was really, really good. So I ended up giving this one a 4.25 stars because it was just so fun and the writing was good, and I really enjoyed it. So that's Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. The next book I read was Two Wrongs Make a Right by Chloe Leese, and this follows Beatrice and Jamie. Beatrice is an artist, and Jamie is kind of like the opposite of her. He's very buttoned up and put together and very kind of like you would consider like a rigid person. They meet at a party and they don't like each other at all. She spills a drink on him. They don't get along. It doesn't go well. Well, her sister and her sister's fiance end up exchanging their numbers for them. I don't remember how exactly that went down, but they end up getting each other's numbers and end up texting each other without actually saying their own names, so they don't know that they're actually texting each other. But through texts, they end up liking each other and hitting it off and like really kind of like getting to know each other in a real way without having any like preconceived notions from that first meeting. So finally, they decide to meet in person and realize who each other are. And so the romance was really, really well fleshed out. The banter is so funny in this book. I really enjoyed every minute of it. The characters are great, and the writing is also really, really good. I didn't love the third act breakup in this one. I thought it was for kind of like a silly reason, but they did get over it, obviously, so it was fine. But in general, I did really, really enjoy this book. It was one of my favorites, and I ended up rating this one 4.25 stars. So that's Two Wrongs Make a Right by Chloe Leese. All right, swiftly moving on. The next book I read was Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood, and this is her YA romance, and this is focused around chess. So this follows Mallory, who's 18 years old, and she used to play chess with her dad all the time. She's really, really good, but her dad ends up dying, and one of her friends is actually running a chess tournament and asks her to participate as a favor to her, so she does, and she accidentally ends up beating the world chess champion Nolan. This was actually one of the funniest books I've read. I was cackling throughout this book because the writing is so good. She is so funny with the writing and the banter, and I just really, really love this one. So if you're kind of deterred from reading a YA book because you don't want to read YA, but you like Ali Hazelwood, I still strongly suggest you pick this one up because it is like hilarious. I personally never cared for chess, and I didn't think I was going to really enjoy this very much, but suddenly I was very invested. I was invested in the games, I was invested in everything that was happening, and I just really, really loved it. It's kind of similar to that TV show, The Queen's Gambit. If you haven't seen that, it's also very good, highly recommend. But this was so good, and I really couldn't put it down. So obviously this is a 5-star, and that's Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood. My pile is getting tall. Okay, we have a few more books left for September. Okay, the next book I read was the literary fiction, and this is going to be a very quick review. That was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, and I actually listened to this one mostly on audio because we were on a road trip and it was just, something easy to listen to on audio. And honestly, I didn't really love this. I found this kind of boring. It's essentially following this mom and her daughters who live on a cherry farm, and they're picking cherries before the season is over. So they need to pick these cherries in time before whatever happens with the cherries. So while they're doing that, the mom used to be an actress, and she's telling them her life story of like when she was an actress and all the relationships she had and the guys she was dating and so on. So that's basically what was going on here. Not much has happened, and I wasn't really all that interested. I found myself kind of bored throughout the entire book, and I finished it pretty quickly just because it was on audio and I was listening to it at like 1.75 speed. And that's really all I have to say about it. I just couldn't get into this book. It was not really my pace and not much was happening, so I ended up rating this one 2.5 stars, and that's Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. Moving on, let's do the dark romance, and that is The Lies We Steal by Monty J, and this is the first book in the Hollow Boy series. So this essentially takes place in Ponderosa Springs, Oregon, at a very exclusive university called Hollow Heights University, and it follows the main character Briar, who comes into town on scholarship, and she attends the university on scholarship, and she comes from Texas, so she's not a townie. She doesn't really know anything about the town. So there is this group of 4 guys who also live in town, and they're like best friends, but what they like to do is like scare people and kind of like harass people in the town, which Briar obviously wasn't aware of because she's not from around there. But they're like the best of friends. They would die for each other. They would go to jail for each other, go to prison for each other, whatever. But they have like this thing where they like to torment and scare people in the town. And the male main character in this book is one of those guys, and his name's Alistair. And they end up kind of like torturing this guy, and Briar ends up seeing it, and they basically catch her spying on them. And in order to make sure that she doesn't tell anybody about it, they kind of like try to scare her into silence. This book has major spooky vibes. I really hated Alistair from the very beginning of this book. I just didn't understand like how this could be a romance and how they were going to come together until like 75% of this book, because of the things that he did and the things that they said. Like a lot of lines are crossed. These guys are very unhinged and kind of crazy, so I just wasn't getting like, how is this going to come together? How is this going to turn into a romance? Because I just didn't get it at first. But it is actually a bully romance, so I wasn't aware of that because I don't really read trigger warnings. Contrary to what I recommend, you should read trigger warnings before you pick up a dark romance. I didn't. I just went in blind, and these guys were just like so crazy and unhinged, and like I just didn't get it until like probably 75% of the book, where it all did kind of come together. So I ended up rating this 3.25 stars because it was one of those books that you just like can't put down because it's just so crazy and unhinged. And it definitely wasn't one of my favorite romances, but I will continue the series because it was interesting and a very fast-paced book that I got through rather quickly, and it had really, really good spooky vibes. So that is The Lies We Steal by Monty J, and that was 3.25 stars. The next one I read was a fantasy, and that is Apprentice to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. And this is the second book to Assistant to the Villain. Now, I think I like the first one better than this one, and I'm not going to get into like details of what's going on in here because this is the second book, obviously, but it continues the story of Evie and Tristan. I really couldn't get into this one as much because I just wasn't into like the events that were happening. It wasn't really keeping my attention, but it still had the really good banter, and I'm glad I read it, and I did enjoy the story itself. I just wasn't really into like the events of like what was happening, and also there just wasn't enough romance in this for me, same as the first book, and it did read a little too YA for me, and I prefer it to be a little bit more adult when it comes to this. It's a really cool concept, but I just really wasn't into like the events and the plot as much as the first one. So I ended up rating this one 3.25 stars, and that is Apprentice to the Villain by Hannah Nicole Mayer. The next book I read was The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson, and this was really, really fun. This is basically kind of like a urban paranormal kind of thing. The two main characters are both shifters. They're doctors in a hospital, and the female main character, Mackenzie, has a grandmother and she is kind of like pressuring her to be in a relationship. Mackenzie's been on a lot of bad dates and she's having a hard time finding like somebody to be with, essentially. And so she ends up accidentally telling her grandmother that she's in a relationship with this guy, Noah, who's a cardiologist at her work. This is a very, very spicy book. It's really, really fun. The writing is so good. I really, really enjoyed it. I gave it a 4.75 stars, and the only reason why I rated down a little bit was because of the third act breakup and the way that Noah handled it, because in the moment it just, to me, didn't really feel like it would be like the way he should handle it. Obviously it was resolved rather quickly. I just didn't think that it fit his character, and that was the only reason why I rated down just slightly. Otherwise it was really, really good, and I had such a great time reading this. So that is The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson. Okay, and the final two books that I read for September are both by Erin Sterling, and that is The Ex-Hex and The Kiss Curse. These are just kind of like paranormal witchy books, really good for Halloween, really fun reads, very cozy and atmospheric, perfect spooky vibes if you're looking for just like a fun book to read in the fall. Highly recommend both of these. The Ex-Hex follows Vivi, who is a witch, and her best friend Gwen, who's also a witch. And Vivi used to date this guy Reese, or Riss, whatever. And they end up breaking up. She puts a hex on him. Time passes. I think it's like 9 years or something like that. And Reese decides to come back into town because he's a member of like the founding families to represent the family during the anniversary of the town. However, because he comes back into town and he has a curse on him, which apparently went wrong, things are starting to get messed up and he doesn't know why. I ended up giving this one 4 stars because it was just like such a fun, cozy read. It's obviously, it's not a scary book or anything like that, but it does have like really good atmospheric, spooky vibes. So I do recommend you read this for like right around Halloween time. And then the other one, the second book in this series, is The Kiss Curse, which actually follows Gwen. I believe she was actually Vivi's cousin in the first book, not her best friend. I think she's her cousin. And Wells. Wells is also part of the Penhallow family who lives in Wales, and he also now gets sent back to Georgia to represent the family to kind of like strengthen their connection to the town. Gwen owns a magical store in town, and then Wells ends up opening a competing magical store right across the street from her. So now they're rivals. They accidentally end up triggering a love spell, hence the Kiss Curse. It all kind of like develops from there. I think I liked the Ex-Hex a little bit more than this one, but this one was still a very atmospheric and cozy read. Still really fun, still perfect for the season, and the writing is really, really good as well. So I ended up giving this one 3.5 stars, and that is The Kiss Curse. So these are all my September books. We have 18 books here, and yeah, I thought that was a really good reading month. So now we can get into my October reads. So let me take these off and then we'll start the new stack right now. I'm back. It's the next day. Let's continue with October reading wrap up. So for October, I read a total of 15 books, and 6 were romance, 7 were fantasy, 1 thriller, and 1 general fiction. October was okay. I think I had the best luck with the romances. The fantasies were not really hitting for me for some reason. Most of them felt kind of like middle of the road and not like really grabbing my attention, and I wasn't super interested in them. So the ratings are super, super average, just FYI. But romance-wise, I think I had a pretty good reading month. All right, so let's get into it. The first book I read was the kind of like literary fiction, historical fiction, which was The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. And this book has been kind of like floating around YouTube. A lot of people have been reading it lately. A lot of Kristen Hanna books are very popular right now, so I thought I would start with this one because I have it. And this is kind of like a historical fiction, even though it's kind of based on true events, or it is based on true events. This is set in World War I when Germany occupies France, and it follows the story of 2 sisters, Vienne and Isabel. And their stories are very, very different. So as France is being occupied, Vienne is the older sister, and she has a daughter, she has a husband. Her husband gets taken away to war, and she's basically just trying to survive. The German soldiers end up taking over her house and like living there and using all her resources, and she goes through a lot of hardships that way. Whereas Isabel is more of like, she's a little bit more free-spirited, so she wants to like help in the war, she wants to contribute, she wants to drive an ambulance, and you know, she kind of like fights and is more vocal about fighting. So they're both very heroic. They both end up doing very heroic things. The book is very, very sad and emotional. I definitely cried a lot during this book. And it's amazing that Kristen Hanna is telling the story of women during this time period. She says this in the book, but women don't really get the recognition back then for all the heroic things that they did and all the things that they went through, which was the exact same thing that men went through, or even worse circumstances. But men are the ones who get the medals, they get the recognition, and women are just kind of like, you know, forgotten about most of the time. So Kristen Hanna is calling attention to their stories, which is amazing. So I rated this one 5 stars, and I will definitely be reading a lot more Kristen Hanna books in the future. Okay, glue. Let's put this here. Hi, I know you're sleeping right here. Let's scoot you over a little bit. Okay. The next book I read for October was Billy Summers by Stephen King, and this follows a contract killer, or like an assassin. His name's Billy Summers, and he is contracted to basically kill somebody, and in order to do so, he has this elaborate plan which will take several months, and he has to essentially move into this town and assimilate himself into the town. Things end up going wrong, and he ends up having to hide. Along the way, he saves this girl, and she ends up staying with him, like living with him in his apartment. It doesn't start off romantic or anything like that. It's just kind of like she's a victim of something, so he's helping her, and she ends up staying with him. I didn't love the writing in this book. It was really hard to get into the story for me. The sentences are super short. It's in third person, and it's like very descriptive of the most mundane things, and I just like had a really hard time getting into it. The story itself is very slow moving. It's not really a thriller, and it's definitely not a horror. It's kind of like this in-between like sad story that I just really wasn't sure like what to categorize it as. It is said to be a thriller. It didn't feel like a thriller. I don't really know like what this story is supposed to be. There's also a lot of triggering material in this book, and it comes up very frequently, so read trigger warnings before you read this. Actually, normally I recommend that for dark romances, so I don't know why I would have to recommend this for a thriller, but like it's pretty dark when it comes to the triggering material in this, so I would highly recommend you read trigger warnings. The very last bit of it, the very ending of this, did kind of pull me in though. It was reading like a 2-star throughout the entire book, but because of the ending, I ended up bumping it up to 2.5 stars. But it was still mostly a downer of a book, and it'll be a while before I pick up another Stephen King book, I think. So that's 2.5 stars for Billy Summers by Stephen King. The next book I read was Swift and Saddled by Lila Sage, and this is the second book in the Rebel Blue Ranch series. This one follows Ada and West. Ada is a divorced interior designer, I believe she was, and then West is living on the ranch, and he's a cowboy, and he's working on like a project. So she comes into town, she stops at a bar, they end up meeting each other randomly, they end up making out, but get interrupted, so nothing happens. And then the next day she comes to the ranch to work on the project because she applied and she basically got hired to work on this project that he's working on. Finds out he's her boss, okay? So it's a little awkward, there's a little bit of a tension, but it's super, super cute. I rated this one 4 stars, maybe it was like a 4.25, I'm not really sure, but it was still really, really cute, still super cowboy romancy, as you know, as you expect from these books, and I really enjoyed it. West struggles with depression, and he did end up telling her that right from the beginning, which I loved that he shared that with her, and it just like really brought good awareness to people who suffer with that. I love the cover of this book as well. It's so cute. And yeah, it could maybe be a 4.25, but it's like in the 4-star range. It wasn't quite as good as Done and Dusted. I enjoyed Done and Dusted a little bit more, but I'm still looking forward to the 3rd book and the 4th book. I think there's going to be 4 total in this series, but I still really enjoyed it. I had a good time reading it. It's very cute, very heartwarming, very like sweet, and a fun read overall. So that's the next one, Swift and Saddled by Lila Sage. The next book I read was Daydream by Hannah Grace, which is the third book in the Maple Hills series, and this follows Hallie and Henry. Hallie is aspiring to be an author by age 25. Well, it starts off with her boyfriend breaking up with her, and it makes her realize that she needs to put her own needs first because she is a perpetual people pleaser. Henry is the captain of the hockey team. He was introduced in the previous 2 books, so this is his book. And he has undiagnosed AUDHD. Now, there is a note from the author at the beginning of the book which explains that, and explains kind of like the writing and like his personality and his character a little bit more, so make sure you read that. He's more of like a daydreamer. He thinks differently than most people. He often falls into like info holes, and prioritization is hard for him amongst other things, and that causes him to fail an assignment, and then his coach hears about it. Now, Hallie lives in her grandma's house. She has like this like grandma core aesthetic, which I'm loving right now. It's so cute, and I love the little cardigans that she wears. She wears her little Taylor Swift folklore cardigans and her little dresses, and it's like the cutest thing ever. So I'm really loving her aesthetic right now. They decide that they need to study together because he's struggling with his assignments and he's having a hard time, so she decides to help him. I really liked their relationship because he's very direct with her. Like, he goes after it. Like, he's very clear about his intentions and his feelings, and he tells her right away, and like he communicates really well when it comes to that. He wants to spend time with her and he lets her know. He definitely comes off as like a quality time, acts of service kind of love language person, which I loved, and their romance just felt really, really genuine, so I loved that. So I ended up rating this 3.75 stars because there was a lot of focus on like his schoolwork and his assignments, and those parts really felt kind of robotic. Now, I'm not sure if it was supposed to be that way, if it was meant to be written that way, but to me the writing felt really robotic. There was a little bit too much focus on like the schoolwork aspect of it, and I just kind of wasn't into that. So that part could have been cut out quite a bit, but I think maybe the author was trying to portray his personality more and like really tried to explain and portray like what he is like when he thinks about like assignments or other things. So it wasn't my favorite of the series, but I still enjoyed it. I still liked reading it. I loved the romance, and I loved how he treated her and like how he communicated with her throughout the book. So that was Daydream by Hannah Grace, and that was 3.75 stars. Okay, the next book I read was People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, and this book follows Poppy and Alex. Poppy and Alex are friends. They're best friends. They met in college. The 2 of them used to go on these summer trips together. They were kind of like low budget trips because they were both kind of like struggling financially because they would be in school, but they still went on these summer trips together, and it was kind of like a yearly tradition for them. Now, they kind of lost touch over time. I think it was like a 2-year span where something kind of went awry, and they ended up not seeing each other for like 2 years, or talking every day for like 2 years. But they eventually reconnect, and they go on one of these trips that they used to take to kind of like rekindle their friendship. The story also kind of alternates timelines between before and after, kind of like in the past and the present, which is very similar to Emily Henry's Happy Place, and I did really enjoy that. The 3rd act breakup in this was a little hard. I did end up tearing up, and I did cry a little bit during that part because it was a little bit sad, FYI, and I really loved the writing. Emily Henry's writing is flawless as always in this book, so I did really enjoy almost every second of this book. So this is definitely one of my favorites, and I highly recommend if you haven't read this one yet. So that's People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, and I rated it 4.5 stars. The next book I read is also by Emily Henry, and that was Book Lovers, and this one I really, really loved. So this basically follows Nora and Charlie. Nora is a book publisher, and she is on her way to a meeting with Charlie, but she gets a phone call from her boyfriend and he ends up dumping her, so she ends up being late to the meeting. Now, Charlie is like a very hardcore kind of like publisher. He is always scowling. He's kind of a stick in the mud. He's never happy. He's hard to please, all those things, right? So naturally, the being late to the meeting part didn't go over very well. Now, their banter really reminds me of that movie with Steve Carell and Rose Byrne. I think it was called Irresistible. It came out in 2020. They were basically both politicians, and they went to a small town in Wisconsin, something like that, but their dynamic really reminded me of the 2 of them, and it was just so funny. The back and forth with the banter was really, really, really good. It did kind of phase out a little bit, like towards the end, and I would have liked to see a little bit more of it. I wish it was like more sprinkled in throughout. Like in Paradise Problem by Christina Lauren, she had the banter and the funny like throughout the entire book, whereas this started off really, really strong with all the banter and then kind of phased out just a little bit. But still really funny, still amazing. I had so many laugh out loud moments throughout this book that I loved it so much. Obviously, Emily Henry's writing is excellent. I love every minute of it, and I just had such a good time. I ended up rating this one 4.75 because it was very, very close to perfect. And after reading this one, I also ended up changing my rating for Funny Story to 4.75 because it just felt kind of like on par with this one. And I might have even liked this one a little bit more than Funny Story, so I don't really know. But I think I want to say that this might be my favorite Emily Henry book, followed by Funny Story, followed by maybe People We Meet on Vacation. I think it's going to be Book Lovers, Funny Story, People We Meet on Vacation, Beach Read, and then Happy Place. Or maybe Happy Place and then Beach Read. I can't really remember my ratings for those two anymore, but I think this is going to be my top Emily Henry book because I just loved it so, so much. So highly recommend if you haven't read this yet. This is Book Lovers by Emily Henry. The next book I read was The Game Changer by Lana Ferguson, and this follows Delilah and Ian. Now, Delilah is a baker and she has her own show. I believe it was called Whiskey Business, but her ratings have been dropping lately. They dropped by like 20%, and her manager calls her in and she essentially has to turn it around because she could get canceled for next season. Ian, on the other hand, is her brother's childhood best friend who used to play in Calgary. He's a hockey player, FYI. He's a professional hockey player. He used to play in Calgary. Now he's going through a divorce and he's coming back to Boston because he got switched teams and he needs some good publicity because of like the rumors circulating around his divorce. So Delilah has this idea to get him on her show because I guess management thinks it would be really good for him publicity-wise because, you know, he's like this big burly hockey player and he doesn't know how to bake and he'll be in an apron. And then obviously Boston loves hockey, so that'll bring up her ratings. And it's like a mutual benefit kind of thing. I, on the other hand, did not think their chemistry was very good. There was a lot of like things that kind of cringed me out in this book actually, because there's a lot of reference to like how large her chest is and like how like, you know, I mean, like there was like so many references to that. I think I was counting like 5 references to that by like chapter 4. It kind of cringed me out a little bit, so it wasn't my favorite thing. And on his part, there's just like so many references to how he thinks that she's like so grown up now, which also cringed me out. Also, like the way that their romance came about wasn't my favorite because like they share a kiss and then it's like super hot and heavy, and like it was just like there was no like build up, there was no lead up to that. It's a lot of like tell not show kind of writing, and it's not my favorite. So I didn't love this one. I still enjoyed it, but I ended up rating it a 3.25. So that's The Game Changer by Lana Ferguson. The next book I read was When in Rome by Sarah Adams, and I think this book has really made me love Sarah Adams because you'll see in a future video, but I ended up reading a few more of her books and I'm really loving all of them. So I think she's one of my new favorite authors. This basically follows a famous singer, Amelia. Her stage name is Ray, but she's about to go on a 9-month world tour. She's very famous, okay? But she's feeling very stressed, very empty inside. She's not loving her life right now. She's also a huge fan of Audrey Hepburn and the movie Roman Holiday, where Audrey Hepburn kind of like escapes to Rome. And so because she's feeling so down about her life right now and feeling stressed and super anxious, she decides to just go off on a road trip and go to Rome, Kentucky. Well, her car is not very good. It's like an old Toyota Corolla and it breaks down like halfway to Rome, and it breaks down in some guy's front yard. Now that some guy is Noah. Noah owns a pie shop. He's kind of like a grump. It's a really funny meet cute. They have such a cute dynamic because he is such a grump, and like every sentence out of his mouth whenever somebody asks him to do something, he's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But like the next sentence following that, he's like doing it, and he's like a real sweetheart about it too. So I just thought it was funny. I thought their chemistry was great. I thought they were hilarious. There were so many funny moments in this book. I really loved the writing, and This was just like a really great, refreshing romance read, so I highly recommend if you haven't read this yet. This was a definite 5 stars. In case you were wondering, it is a closed-door romance, just FYI. But highly recommend. So funny, so cute, absolutely loved it. So that's When in Rome by Sarah Adams. The next book I read was A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson, and this follows Dracula, or who I assume to be Dracula, and this girl Constanta. This starts off with this village being raided and a lot of people dying, and this girl Constanta, I think that was her name from the beginning, I'm not sure, he might have changed it. But she's dying and Dracula approaches and he turns her into a vampire to save her life. This story is basically letters from her to him, kind of like describing their entire life and telling about like how like they've built this family together and over like hundreds and hundreds of years, okay? This is a very quick read because it is in letter format and it is so interesting. It definitely grabbed my attention from the very beginning. It's very good for spooky season. It almost read a little bit like a thriller, but not really like a thriller. It's definitely spooky, definitely paranormal. Very, very good. Highly recommend if you like vampire books, and it's just so different than anything else that I've read because of like the format that it's written and actually the course of events that happens in this book. So I ended up rating this one 4 stars, and that is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. The next book I read was The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo, and this is a historical fantasy but also kind of like a vampire-y one. It's set during the Spanish Inquisition and follows this like scullion maid Luisia. I don't really know how to say her name, but she's a scullion maid and she works for Doña Valentina. She has like these magical powers, I guess, that were passed on to her through like these magical spells, through songs that she was taught as a child, but she doesn't really know how to control her magic very well. She just basically sings these songs, which are composed of like different languages, and they're actually magical spells. Now, she only uses them for like little things so that she doesn't get caught, because if she gets caught, she'll definitely get kicked out by her mistress. It's just to like do little small things to help herself in life, like fix her burnt bread, or you know, like just like small things, right? But her mistress, Doña Valentina, notices that something is awry, and she basically finds out that she can do this magic. So in order to kind of like help her social standing, Doña Valentina makes her perform these spells in front of their guests, and she makes her perform them like every single night. Well, so that catches the attention of a different house, and the master of the other house kind of like brings her on to live with him. He offers to pay her a lot more money, so she obviously does go there. And he has this familiar who is basically immortal, and he's imprisoned. So his job, in order to be set free from being the familiar of this guy, he has to essentially train Luisia to control her powers and then become the king's champion. So there is a romance between them, between Luisia and the familiar. The romance in here was not my favorite. Throughout the entire story, they seemed kind of like student-teacher relationship, but then suddenly once the romance hit, they like meant everything to each other, and I like a lot more build-up. Obviously, I like a lot more angst, I like a lot more tension, and this book just didn't deliver that. I ended up giving it a 2.75 stars because the ending did pick up a little bit. It was kind of reading like a 2-star throughout the entire thing because I just wasn't into the whole historical fantasy portion of it, but it did pick up at the end, and I bumped it up to 2.75 stars. So that's The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. The next book I read was Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber, and this is the first book of the Once Upon a Broken Heart series, and this is a YA fantasy. This follows Evangeline and Jax, who is the Prince of Hearts, and he is a fate. She makes a bargain with him because her stepsister is about to get married to like this guy Luke that she's in love with, and she obviously doesn't want that. So he agrees to help her. In order for him to stop the wedding, she has to like kiss 3 people that he chooses, essentially. So she has to, kiss 3 people of his choosing. For whatever reason, I don't really know. This wasn't my favorite. I really couldn't get into this book. It felt really, really young and juvenile for some reason, and I was really hoping to like this book because I liked Stephanie Garber's Caraval series, but this one felt like the writing was a lot younger than even that series. So I was a little bit confused, and I just couldn't get into it because it felt really, really young, like really young, not even young adult young, but like high school, kind of like grade school maybe young, which is okay. It just wasn't what I expected, and I expected it to be a little bit more like the Caraval series. Also, for some reason, the writing kind of bothered me in this one because it felt way too descriptive of like the dresses and the rooms, and like it was super flowery, which I know that that also was the case in the Caraval series, but for some reason it didn't bother me as much in that series as it did with this series. So I didn't enjoy that part of it. I really wasn't into the book as much. I ended up switching to audio like maybe like halfway through, but it didn't really help all that much, and I was just kind of like wanting to finish really fast because I just couldn't get into the story. I ended up rating this one a 2.5, which is a surprise to myself as well because again, I really expected to like this. I expected to like this series a lot more than even the Caraval series, but unfortunately this one just wasn't for me. I did end up reading the other books in a future month, which you will see in a future video, but unfortunately this series, it just didn't grab me. I couldn't get into it, and it just felt a little bit too young for me. So 2.5 stars for Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber. The next one I read was Reckless by Lauren Roberts, and this is the second book in the Powerless series. This book continues the story of Peyton and Kai. There are no trials in this one this time, but he is basically trying to track her down for a crime that she committed. I don't really remember what really happened in this book. It felt a little bit like a filler book, and like that there weren't very many events that happened. I remember liking it okay while I was reading. The writing was still good. There were a few repetitive scenes, I think, but nothing really that grabbed me. I wasn't super into it. I just kind of felt like I was reading words on paper. It didn't really grab me. It didn't really pull me in. It didn't keep my interest very much. There weren't too many events happening, and it was just okay, essentially. I will continue this series because I liked the first book better than this one, and this one felt kind of like a filler book, so I'm hoping that the third book will be better. But I did end up liking this okay, and I rated this one 3 stars. The next book I read was Belladonna by Adalyn Grace, and this is a YA fantasy. This essentially follows the main character Signa, who we don't know why, but when she eats these poisonous belladonna berries, she doesn't die. Okay, whereas everybody else dies when they eat these belladonna berries. Well, she's 19 and she is orphaned. Her parents are dead. She's being taken care of her relatives, and every single one of her relatives that is taking care of her dies mysteriously. Okay, so currently she's living with this aunt who is awful, and she also mysteriously dies. So now she's being taken to live with the Hawthorns, which is another family and her last living relatives. When she gets there, she finds out that the daughter is sick, the mother is also dead, and the son is like really selfish and kind of like crazy, and the father throws these like lavish parties because he's really, really afraid. So this is more of like a mystery where she's trying to uncover like why the daughter is sick, why the mother is dead, and like that kind of thing. She ends up talking to Death somehow. It's kind of interesting. I did like Signa as a character. It is a YA book, but it didn't really read YA. The writing was a little bit more complex than most YA books I've read, so I did really enjoy this, but this is another one of those books where the romance was not my favorite because like there's very little romance in it. It doesn't happen until like the last 25% of the book, and like you really don't see them having any romance between each other, and then suddenly it's like they're everything to each other again. So that wasn't my favorite. There also wasn't enough of the romance throughout the entire book for me, and that whole aspect of it wasn't my favorite. But I did enjoy the writing. I did enjoy Signa as a character. I liked the mystery aspect of this, and I ended up rating this one 3.25 stars. And then I went directly into Foxglove by Adalyn Grace, which is the second book in this Belladonna series, and this continues the story of Signa. And also this book introduces Fate, which is Death's brother. I wasn't into this one as much as the first one. This one was okay, but it wasn't my favorite. I think the writing felt a little bit more flowery in this one, but maybe I just didn't notice that that was the case in the first one. but I couldn't get into this one as much. I definitely liked the first book, and this one did feel a little bit more of like a filler book again. I ended up rating this one 2.75 stars, but I will be continuing the series because the third book, Wisteria, has already come out, so I will be buying that and reading this because, again, I'm hoping that it's probably going to be better and more like the first book, whereas this one kind of felt a little bit like a filler book. So that's Foxglove by Adalyn Grace. Sorry if the camera moved a little bit. I had to swap the battery because it died, but we are back and we are going to discuss the final book of October that I read, which was Throne of the Fallen by Kerri Maniscalco. And this is a new adult fantasy which follows Camila, who's the main character. She owns a gallery that she inherited from her parents. She's a very talented painter. And when her family was struggling financially, what she did was kind of forged this famous painting and sold it. But the guy that she sold it to, Lord Vexley, he's very knowledgeable about art, and he could tell that it was a forgery. Then this other guy comes into town. He's actually the Prince of Envy, but he goes by Lord Sinton, or Sin for short, and he offers to help her. I did enjoy this book enough to want to continue with this series. I enjoyed the writing. The writing was very good. Their romance was actually really good. The only thing that kind of bothered me about this was the Regency setting. The whole society there is very controlling when it comes to women, the gossip and the proper etiquette and all that, and having to be chaperoned, and that whole discussion of the society and the Regency setting is not really my favorite to read about. But other than that, I did really enjoy this book. I liked the writing, I liked the romance, it kept my attention, it was fun to read, and it was interesting. So I ended up rating this one 3.5 stars, and that is Throne of the Fallen by Kerri Maniscalco. So that's it. Those are all the books I read in October. That's 15 books total. Unfortunately, a lot of the fantasies I read in October really didn't hit. They really didn't grab my attention, and I wasn't really connecting with these stories too much. And I don't know if it was because I wasn't ready to be reading fantasy quite yet, and I was just kind of trying to force myself to read fantasy because of the season. But I did end up liking some of them, and a lot of the romance books that I read were actually really, really great, and I found some favorite books this month. Okay, thank you so much for watching. Here is my stack of books. I have to hold them from behind because they're going to fall over. But here is my stack of books. These are all the books I read in September and October. I think I made really great progress on my physical TBR. Most of these are ones I've had on my physical TBR for a while. I didn't really buy very many new books, but I'm super happy with my progress, and I found a lot of new favorite books. So that's all I have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.